Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Euripides' play, The Cyclops. Now this is one of the most important ancient Greek plays because it is the only surviving example of its genre, which is the Satyr play. So in ancient Greece, the way that tragedies were presented was that each author, so they didn't have the sort of theater culture that we have today where like you could just go out to a theater and see a show whenever one was playing. They had theater festivals, the two biggest in Athens being the City Dionysia and the Linnaea. And the City Dionysia was really the big theater festival of the year. And so every tragedian who was scheduled to present plays in the Dionysia would present 3 tragedies and 1 satyr play. So we always talk about trilogies when we're talking about ancient Greek drama because they were presented in sets of 3. The Oresteia is the only extant trilogy that we have, where we have all 3 of the plays that were presented at one time. And often the trilogies were not something like the Oresteia, where they're 3 parts of the same story. They would often be 3 different stories that were in some way thematically connected. But this video isn't about tragedy. This video is about the Cyclops, the satyr play. So the satyr play was the 4th component of that set of tragedies, the 4th component of that dramatist's entry. It's a comedy, but it's not in the vein of old comedy like we get with Aristophanes or new comedy like we get with Menander. The satyr play takes as its subject matter mythical stories. So the same kinds of subject matter that you get with tragedies, except rather than handling it tragically, it's handled comically. So the Cyclops, for instance, Euripides' Cyclops, comes from Book 9 of the Odyssey. It's the story of Odysseus being trapped in the cave by the Cyclops, Polybius, and then blinding Polybius by jamming a giant fire-hardened stake into his eye, and then fleeing the cave. So that's the subject matter of Euripides' play, but it's presented in really a carnivalesque fashion. What I mean by carnivalesque, this is a term that comes to us from the literary theorist Mikhail Bakhtin, Mikhail Mikhailovich Bakhtin. And basically he came up with this idea that there are particular types of literature, in particular medieval literature, where the emphasis is entirely terrestrial. So they're very grounded in sex and sexuality. They're very grounded in food. They're very grounded in alcohol. They're grounded in music. These sort of earthly pleasures, or earthy pleasures, if you will. And that's what we get a lot with the satyr plays. Because these really are, they're called satyr plays because they tended to have satyrs in them. And satyrs, for those of you who don't know, we tend to think of nowadays of Roman satyrs who had the lower half of a goat, and then horns and goat's ears and things like this. But Greek satyrs were often sort of part horse rather than part goat. But they're regarded as extremely lecherous, extremely alcoholic, etc., etc. So that comes across in the satyr plays. So basically you think of like tragic subject matter with satyrs. Tragic subject matter with people who are sort of, I say people, half goat, half human, or half horse, half human, whatever it is. People really obsessed with sex, really obsessed with wine, really obsessed with feasting, really obsessed with music. So what happens in this, the way that Euripides' play differs from what we get in the Odyssey is that Selenius, who's a satyr, a sort of elder satyr, and a group of his younger satyrs, his sons, or his boys, we're out looking for Bacchus, we're out looking for Dionysus, who's been kidnapped by some pirates, and they get captured by Polybius, the Cyclops, remember. And they're basically sort of put to work tending his flocks and things like this. When Odysseus shows up, and Odysseus initially just wants to trade some wine, which the satyrs haven't had for a long time because the Cyclopses don't grow grapes and they don't have viticulture, the making of wine. So Odysseus, initially when he shows up and sees Selenius, is trying to get his bearings. So he asks, but who does this place belong to? Wild animals? Selenius says, Cyclopses. They live in caves, not houses. Odysseus says, ruled by whom? Or is it a democracy? Selenius says, hillbillies, ruled by no one, no how. Odysseus says, do they till and sow? How do they live? Selenius says, milk, cheese, and the eternal mutton chop. Odysseus says, in vineyards surely they must make wine. Selenius, throwing up his hands in disgust, not a chance. This is a grim land, no frolics, dancing. Odysseus says, hospitable? Are they nice to foreigners? Or are they nice to strangers? Selenius, with a grimace, charming. Strangers make the best eating of all, they say. Odysseus says, don't tell me they gorge on human flesh. And Selenius says, every guest that comes here gets devoured. So again, we've got these themes of feasting, these themes of eating, but in this case, it's a perverse version of eating. But again, Odysseus has brought wine to trade for food and fresh water. And Selenius, who, again, is a satyr, loves wine, loves sex, loves feasting, etc., has this speech. And again, you'll get these sort of earthy components, this carnivalesque feel. He says, I'd go crazy for just one cup of that wine. I'd sell the entire flocks of all the Cyclopses. I'd leap into the briny sea from the Leucadian rock for just one little tipple to smooth my frown. A man who isn't merry in his cups is a solemn fool. Besides, and here he points at the long phallus that was part of the satyr's costume. It makes you stand up straight while you get your two hands around some lovely little soft boobs and elsewhere. That's when you can really dance and put paid to all your worries. So why shouldn't I blow a kiss to a drink like that and tell the mindless Cyclops to go and cry his one big eye out? So again, we've got this element of sexuality, we've got this element of feasting, this element of alcoholism, etc., etc. But we get this perverse reversal of that sort of carnivalesque joy, because for Bakhtin, the carnivalesque is always about freedom, it's about sort of liberation, it's about being able to enjoy in an egalitarian way, in a world that's primarily about suffering, primarily about hard work, primarily about privation. So we get that reversal of the carnivalesque, or perversion of the carnivalesque, with Polybius himself, with the Cyclops. Because at one point he has this speech. And so the other thing about the carnivalesque that's worth sort of remembering here is that the carnivalesque undoes hierarchies. So in the medieval carnivals, you would often have a character called the Lord of Fools. And this would be a peasant or just sort of a regular everyday person, someone on the lowest rung of the social spectrum, who would be elevated to a sort of mock monarchy for the day. And so, that disrupting of hierarchies is really central to the liberatory component of the Carnivalesque. And so Polybius has this speech to Odysseus. He says, "And I'm not one to shudder at Zeus's thunder either. I even doubt that Zeus is a greater god than I. Anyway, I don't give a damn. And why don't I give a damn? Because when he showers anything down from above, I'm all snug in my rocky shack. And after a good dinner of roast lamb or game washed down with a tank of milk, I'm flat on my back. So when Zeus claps out his thunder, I from my blankets blast out a fart. And when the north wind swarms in with snow from Thrace, I just bury myself in furs and light a fire. I snap my fingers at the snow. Meanwhile, the earth, whether it likes it or not, has to grow the grass that feeds my flocks. No sacrifices do I celebrate except to myself. Certainly not to the gods, only to the greatest god of them all, the god right here. To eat and drink from day to day without a care in the world, that's the Zeus for any man of sense. On those who festoon our human life with laws, I cry down bitter tears. So I shan't stop pampering myself. I'm going to eat you." So again, we have this sort of reversal, this erasure of hierarchies, and we have this very sort of earthy, bodily centered ethos of eating, of farting, etc., etc. But it's also a perverse version of this, because the upshot of it is ultimately that Polybius plans to eat Odysseus. So it's not liberatory, it's not egalitarian, it's not about justice and a sort of sharing a communal meal type thing. It's still undergirded by violence and by this sort of destructive impulse. But this also is genuinely a source of fun. This sort of carnivalesque element is genuinely a source of fun in the play. And we get this especially, one sort of great example is when Odysseus is getting Polybius drunk. So this is Odysseus's plan, is to feed Polybius as much of the wine as he can get him to drink, so that Polybius will pass out, so they can stake him in the eye and make their escape. And throughout this scene, where Odysseus is basically pumping Polybius full of wine, Selenius keeps stealing the cup and drinking cup after cup of wine himself. So we go through this. There's like 5 different times here. So at one point we got a stage direction, and all of these stage directions, by the way, are things that the editor or the translator of this version, which in this case is Paul Roche, has added in. None of these stage directions would have been in the original Greek text. But we've got, for instance, Selenius pours out the wine with a little water added and lifts it to his lips. So that in ancient Greece, people almost never drank wine straight. Now, their wine was a lot stronger than the wine that tends to be made today, but you always cut it with water. The amount of water that you used depended on the type of wine and your personal preferences, but the Greeks really looked down on being drunk as such. Even though they drank a lot of wine, it was very, very heavily mixed with water in most cases. So Selenius is taste testing the wine to make sure that the mixture is correct. In the next bit, he grabs a bunch of wildflowers growing near and jams them over the Cyclops' eye while with his other hand raising the bowl to his lips. So he's garlanding the Cyclops to be able to sneak more wine. Then he says, "Well, now wipe off your chin before you sip." And in stage direction, Selenius refills the bowl as the Cyclops wipes his face with the back of his hand. So again, Selenius is just sort of drinking cup after cup of this wine, that Odysseus is trying to use to get the Cyclops drunk so that he can escape being eaten.